Hello, everybody. This talk is actually a handful of remarks on translation seen as a unique experience in the translator's personal life. It will be a little psychological when we concentrate on individually perceived emotions. It will be a little sociological when we focus on the people for whom translators do their job. It will also be a little philosophical when we touch upon the problem of understanding or interpretation, and when it turns out that any translated text may bring about very specific changes in the lives of particular people, the changes that may be viewed from the ethical perspective. The talk is inspired by chapter 5 of the book entitled After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation, published by George Steiner in 1975. In this chapter, Steiner presents translation as a hermeneutic motion. The most important fragment of this chapter was translated into Polish by Olga and Wojciech Kupiński and published in 2009 in the book Współczesne teorie przekładu, Antologia. All quotations used here come from these two sources. Before going any further, it has to be stressed that this talk was not designed as a thorough and profound analysis of the concept of hermeneutic motion. It will only present and develop those of Steiner's claims that point at the inevitability of the translator's personal engagement in the job of translation. For translators, this engagement may be the source of frustration when the translation goes wrong, or the source of deep satisfaction when the job is well done. So, for Steiner, every act of translation is an instance of hermeneutic motion. But what does this hermeneutic motion mean? First, it should be stressed that the word motion should be understood here as an act, as an activity of doing something, as performing some form of action. This action is, of course, performed by the translator. The second word here is hermeneutic, which means somehow related to hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, in turn, as an approach to the study of language, human mind, and translation, according to what Steiner says, is an attempt to answer the question, what does it mean to understand a spoken or written utterance in a language? Therefore, a hermeneutic motion is an act focused on the process of understanding of a particular text, on discovering its meaning, or maybe on giving the meaning to the text. Undoubtedly, while translating, we go through this process when we attempt to understand the original text and when we consciously compose the text of our translation to make it be understood by others the way we want it to be understood. Steiner claims that translation as a hermeneutic motion consists of 4 moves. He writes the following: the hermeneutic motion, the act of elicitation and appropriative transfer of meaning, is fourfold. In this quotation, it is absolutely clear that this motion is an act, a form of action performed by the translator. This was already mentioned above. This action is performed on meanings, and the essence of this action is to elicit the meaning and to appropriate it, which means here to somehow grab it, steal it, and take it away with you to a completely different world. We will talk more about it when we pass on to the second move, and now let's concentrate on the first move of the hermeneutic motion. The first move is to trust. Steiner notices that translators, before they begin to try to understand the original text, have to assume that the text is at all comprehensible, that the text is not a string of randomly chosen words, that the text can be understood. This assumption is the necessary condition to begin any work on the translation of the text. And interestingly enough, this assumption is made by the translators even before they see the original text for the first time. So, if translators can or even have to develop trust in the comprehensibility of the text before seeing it for the first time, this trust is not based on the knowledge of the text itself. So where does it come from? Steiner claims that we, human beings, have a natural disposition to assume that anything that looks like a string of signs intentionally produced by another person indeed has a meaning, and that somehow we will be able to grasp it. This trust is therefore a form of belief, a form of confidence in the author, and as a result, in the meaningfulness of the text produced by the author. In other words, this trust is rooted in the translator's generosity towards the author. Of course, this generosity develops in the translator more easily if the text which is to be translated comes from the author whose text the translator has already successfully translated. Apart from this generosity, there are also other factors that may build up the translator's trust in the meaningfulness of the text, even if the text is written by someone excuse me, who is completely unknown to the translator. Steiner mentions here social incentive, the officious evidence of the precedent. Possibly his words might be understood in the following way. Some other people whom I trust say that the text makes sense, so I assume it as well. In real life situations, there seem to be quite many people from whom the translator may get a proof of the meaningfulness of a particular text. It can be the editor or the reviewer of the text. It can be a critic or any other reader who has read the text and doesn't question its comprehensibility. Such proofs may also come from institutionalized sources. The fact that a text has been published by a renowned publishing house may also be seen as a confirmation of the comprehensibility of the text. However, there seems to be one more dimension to the translator's trust that apparently Steiner does not mention. It is the translator's trust in his or her own intellectual capacity to successfully translate the text. Put simply, translators make commitments to translate particular texts when they trust that they will manage to do it. Taking all that into account, it seems reasonable to agree with Steiner's claim that at the first stage of hermeneutic motion, at the stage of trust, a very important factor is the translator's experience. This experience allows the translator to decide which particular people and institutions may or may not be regarded as credible sources of proofs of the text's meaningfulness, and to decide which authors may or may not be believed to have written comprehensible texts. This experience also allows translators to estimate to what extent they may trust or not in their own efficiency and competence. It is not surprising then that the work of a translator is particularly difficult for beginners. However, this trust in the author, in the text, and in oneself never reaches the final or ultimate level. And the degree of this trust is definitely not unchangeable. Yes, it allows the translator to begin the process of understanding the original text, the process which very often is immediately accompanied by the first attempts to find the appropriate means of expression in the target language. But when this process begins, the degree of trust may change very quickly. It may rise, it may drop. Unfortunately, this trust may also disappear entirely. Of course, all these fluctuations in the translator's trust may be triggered by the whole text or by its particular fragments. So in the translator's mind, there may appear questions such as, is it really so that this text or fragment does not make any sense? Or is it only me who cannot grasp it? Will I ever find a way to express it in the target language, the meaning that I see in the original text? Undoubtedly, such questions cause frustrations in all translators. Arguably, this frustration reaches its highest point when the translator's trust in herself or himself and in the text is gone, and when a resignation from the job is just impossible. Let us come back for a moment to this question. Will I ever find a way to express in the target language the meaning that I see in the original text? It seems to be particularly problematic in two situations described by Steiner. In the first situation, the translator may find out that, as Steiner puts it, anything or almost anything can mean everything. It may happen when the original text triggers a multitude of associations, when it is overloaded with meanings, when in a number of ways it is connected with other texts, with social, cultural, intellectual, emotional, and religious lives of particular individuals, individuals or societies. When there are numerous, often conflicting interpretations of the text. Such texts are usually the texts written by the classics of different cultures and religious texts. However, the problem of ambiguity, to a lesser degree, of course, may also concern the texts which are currently regarded as those of lower cultural value. In the second situation, the translator realizes that the meaning of the original text or the meaning of its fragment cannot be separated from how it was said in the original text and cannot be reconstructed in the target language. In other words, the translator feels that what was said in the original text can be said only in the language of the original text and in the way it was actually said in this text. It simply seems untranslatable. The easiest examples could be here puns, plays on words, jokes, maxims, sayings. What do translators do in these situations? To answer this question, it is necessary to pass on to the second move of Steiner's hermeneutic motion. Actually, we have already started talking about the second move. It begins when the translator gets engaged in the process of understanding the text. This process is a test of the translator's trust, and while going through this process, the translator encounters problematic situations, such as the two situations mentioned earlier. For Steiner, this process means aggression, comparable to military aggression. In the second move of hermeneutic motion, the translator's act is that of incursion into the territory of the text. The translator attacks the text, forcefully extracts the meaning from the text, and takes the meaning into captivity. Now the translator possesses the meaning, and it is the translator's decision what to do with this meaning. But why does Steiner describe the process of understanding a text in terms of a military attack and appropriation or a forceful takeover of the meaning of the text. Steiner, basing on the writings of Hegel and Heidegger, claims that every act of understanding any entity in the world, not only the act of understanding a text, is an act of appropriation of this entity, an act of making this entity yours. If you understand something, you make it meaningful to you. To understand something means to absorb it into your being, into your mind, and make it, sometimes by force, make it fit the whole structure of your knowledge, your experience, your intentions, and expectations. The process of understanding a text, then, metaphorically speaking, may be seen as an invasion of the text with the intention of finding there something that may be taken away as your own. So if you are a translator, you invade the text and your weapon is your mind. You invade the text because you trust you will find there something that can be made understandable to you. You also trust you will find a way to take it and deliver it to the users of a different language. However, as was mentioned earlier, you may be confronted with very frustrating problems. You may have a problem with making the text understandable to you. If you manage to understand it, you may feel that the load of meanings is too heavy and too complex to take it all and to deliver it to the ones who speak a different language. You may also feel that what you want to take and deliver is inseparable from the original text, culture, and language. Is it absolutely necessary to think about the process of understanding a text in military terms? Probably not. This process may be seen as a calm act of interpretation. Of course, this act of interpretation requires from the translator quite a lot of intellectual effort. The translator needs to understand the circumstances in which the original text was written and develop empathy for the author of the text and for the recipients of the text. This effort, however, does not necessarily have to be seen as a fierce fight with the text. It may be seen as a deliberate development of the translator's knowledge and communicative competence. However, in the process of understanding a text by the translator, there are certain moments when the translator indeed behaves like an aggressive intruder into the domain of meanings, and when, unfortunately, this intrusion is probably unavoidable. Because what can you do in these frustrating situations when the load of meanings is too big and complex, or when a particular meaning seems inseparable from the way it was said in the original text? The only option is to tear out from the original meaning as much as you can, or as much as you need to go on with your job. Having done it, you may have the feeling that you have ruined the domain of meanings of the original text, and that the text of your translation will not be a replica of the original text, that the text of your translation will provide the readers with a distorted image of the original text. Sometimes you may even feel that you have been forced to do something unfair. Now, let's move on to the third movement in Steiner's hermeneutic motion, which is incorporation. Incorporation is the act in which the meaning taken or torn out from the domain of the meaning of the original text is articulated in the other language, the target language. It is also the act of introducing the text of translation into the culture of the speakers of the target language and into the sphere of their communication. For Steiner, the act of incorporation is like an act of importing meanings created in one world into a world of a different culture, different systems of meanings, values, and beliefs. The importer, then, the translator, does not transfer the meanings in a vacuum, does not dump them or throw them into a vacuum. These meanings always land among all sorts of meanings that are already there, that make up the history of communication and existence of people living in the target culture. And these important meanings come from the outside, from a different world. They are like foreign bodies in the organism of the target culture. So there is always a possibility or a risk that they will bring about changes, transformations in this organism. Steiner proposes to think about these possible transformations in terms of two related but contrasting metaphors: the metaphor of sacramental intake and the metaphor of infection. If the text of translation is absorbed by the target culture as sacramental intake, it becomes a kind of valuable intellectual food or nourishment beneficial for the culture, something that makes the culture stronger, richer. But a text of translation may also become an infective agent in the organism of the target culture. It may initiate the spread of certain patterns of thoughts and action that will increase the weaknesses of the target culture. That, in turn, may lead to the degeneration of the target culture, also a situation in which the culture of the original text dominates over the target culture. It is worth noting that the problem mentioned here may also contribute to the translator's frustration, because if you translate a text, you bear the responsibility, at least part of the responsibility, for the effects of the text, of your translation, on the recipients of the text. And frequently, it is very difficult to predict this effect in advance. Besides, once the effect is there, the judgments about its value may vary according to who makes the judgments. The act of translation may also have a beneficial or harmful influence on the translator, as was mentioned above. While translating, you get engaged in the process of understanding the original text. You strive to make this understanding as complete as possible, which means that very often you open up your mind to new concepts, ways of thinking, and emotions. These new elements may remain in your mental framework and change the way you see the world and you see yourself. They may, as Steiner writes, add to your means, so make you intellectually and emotionally richer, but they may also make you lame, weaker, feeble, and confused. So, as a translator, at a certain point, you may ask yourself, how much have I gained? And how much have I lost? There is one more thing connected with the stage of incorporation, something that Steiner does not write about in his text. The process of formulating the text of translation and introducing it into the living organism of the target culture is very complex, and the translator is not alone in this process. There are other people involved in it. Usually, they are editors and publishers, and the translator has to cooperate with them. Of course, the translator does the main part of the job and bears the greatest responsibility for the overall effects of the translation project, but still, the translator's work is often a form of teamwork with all its advantages and disadvantages. So if you are a translator, your publisher and editor may provide you with invaluable support. Drawing on their own experience, they may advise you how to approach all kinds of problems that you are confronted with in your work. However, the necessity to cooperate with them may also cause much trouble and anxiety if they insist that you translate the text or its fragment in the way which you find inappropriate or even completely wrong. In such situations, you have to construct strong arguments to support your point of view or look for a consensus. If a situation like this takes an extreme form, you may even think you should consider giving up the job. Such situations, however frustrating and unpleasant, broaden the translator's personal experience. The last stage of hermeneutic motion is compensation or restitution, understood as the restoration of balance between the original text and the text of translation. As was mentioned above, Steiner assumes that what the translator expresses in the text of translation is the meaning that was earlier torn out from the whole domain of the meanings of the original text. As a result, the recipients of the text of translation do not get a replica of the original text. They get a distorted imitation of the original text. In the act of translation, in the process of transforming the original text into the text of translation, the original text loses at least some of its meaning. The stage of restitution is the stage at which this loss may be or even should be compensated for. But how is it possible? How can the original text benefit from translation? How can the act of translation, the act which actually distorts the original text, result in any gain for this original text? The original text gains from the very fact that it has been translated. To decide that a text should be translated is to dignify this text. The act of translation is like a public statement that the text has international importance, that its value has been recognized by people living in a different culture and speaking a different language. The act of translation raises the status of the original text. Besides, when the original text is translated into a foreign language, it produces an echo that may reach many people living in another culture. And this echo is more than a shadow. The text really gains new readers and new critics. It really begins to play a role in another culture, to influence the intellectual and emotional lives of people speaking a different language. In other words, the act of translation gives the original text new life in a new world. Also, the act of translation may reveal that the original text possesses certain meanings which the recipients of the original text did not grasp. But what does it practically mean that the original text gains all these things when it is translated into a foreign language? Steiner does not mention it in his text, but it seems obvious that all these benefits go to particular people who are in some relationship to the original text. So the act of translation raises the status of the original text, but it also raises the status of the author of this text. It may also raise the status of the publisher. A successful translation project may give the author of the original text a lot of satisfaction, but may also generate extra income for the author or for the copyright owners. As to other people who have emotional or intellectual ties with the original text or with its author, They may be simply proud of the fact that the author has earned international recognition. So the translator is the one who takes the moral and ethical responsibility for a two-way flow of meanings, as well as social, cultural, psychological, and even economic benefits. The flow between the world in which the original text was created and the world in which the text of translation is incorporated. Arguably, this flow takes its best form when the culture that absorbs the text of translation gets stronger, and the text of the original gets the recognition that it really deserves. A conscious translator is usually aware of this responsibility, and this awareness makes the job of translation even more difficult. At this point, one could ask the following question. Isn't this idea of hermeneutic motion only about the process of translating very important literary, philosophical, or religious texts? The answer is no. The problems discussed by Steiner, at least some of them, are likely to appear in the process of translation of all kinds of texts, technical, scientific, academic, legal, and functional, because how can you translate any of such texts if you do not trust that this text makes sense? Is it really impossible to find in such texts certain fragments that seem ambiguous, certain meanings which are culture or language specific? If you are translating such texts, shouldn't you consider the recipients of the text of translation and their possible reactions? Shouldn't you keep in mind that what you're doing will affect the author of the original text or other people who are in some relationship to this text? So the conclusion might be that it is impossible to translate any text and not to encounter any problem described by Steiner. And since there are no universal ways of dealing with these problems, every act of translation may be a unique experience in the translator's personal life. Thank you very much for your attention.